I walked into the bank with exactly $3.12 to my name, intending to close my account forever. But when the branch manager glanced at his screen, his face went completely pale. He stuttered, his hands actually shaking as he adjusted his tie. Are you aware there is a $51 million deposit clearing in your personal account? I had never seen that kind of money in my entire life, and the best part was, my family had just kicked me out onto the street. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Naomi. I am 32 years old, and until recently my family treated me like the dirt on their designer shoes. The nightmare reached its breaking point last night at Le Coucou, one of the most expensive French restaurants in New York City. We were supposedly there to celebrate the 5th wedding anniversary of my older sister Audrey and her husband Jamal. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the pristine white tablecloths, and the air hummed with the quiet conversations of Manhattan's elite. I sat at the very end of the table nursing a single glass of tap water while my family devoured imported caviar and drank vintage champagne. When the waiter arrived with the leather checkbook, Jamal snatched it up with a theatrical sigh. He glanced at the total, then tossed the heavy leather folder directly onto my empty bread plate. It landed with a loud smack that made the neighboring tables turn to look. "You are paying tonight," Naomi Jamal announced, his voice booming across the elegant dining room. "Consider it your contribution to the family. You have been freeloading in your parents' basement for 5 years now. It is time you paid your fair share." I stared at the bill. The total was $4,500. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my hands to remain perfectly still. I looked up at Jamal. He was a 36-year-old wealth manager at a top-tier investment fund, a man who measured human worth strictly by the brand of watch on their wrist. His custom-tailored suit probably cost more than my entire net worth. Beside him, Audrey was sipping her champagne with a smirk that perfectly matched his. "I did not even eat anything tonight, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice low to avoid a scene. "I had water." Audrey let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, stop acting like a victim, Naomi. You live rent-free in Mom and Dad's house while you play around on your computer all day. The least you can do is treat us to a nice dinner." My mother, Patricia, wiped her mouth with a linen napkin and leveled a cold stare at me. "Audrey is right, Naomi. You are 32 years old and a medical school dropout. You do nothing but write useless code in that basement. We have carried your dead weight long enough. In fact, your father and I have made a decision. You have until the end of the month to clear your things out of the basement." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You are kicking me out." "We need the space," my mother replied, casually signaling the waiter for more wine. "Audrey and Jamal just bought a new French bulldog. They need the basement cleared out so they can build a climate-controlled gym for the dog when they bring him over to visit." A gym for a dog. I looked at my father, Richard, hoping for some intervention. He owned a real estate firm that was supposedly doing well, though I knew they were secretly drowning in debt to maintain their lavish lifestyle. My father just swirled his whiskey and refused to meet my eyes. "It is for the best, Naomi," he muttered. "Maybe being homeless will finally force you to get a real job." The absolute audacity of their words burned through my veins. Freeloading. That was the word Jamal had used. I looked right at Audrey's diamond necklace. It was incredibly ironic that they called me a freeloader when I was the one who was forced to pay for Audrey's luxury lifestyle. "Funny you bring up fair shares, Audrey," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I seem to recall that my entire college savings account was drained to pay for your luxury real estate licensing courses when you failed your exams 3 times. And that rusty piece of junk car I am driving right now? That is only because Mom and Dad took my remaining savings to buy you a brand new Mercedes for your wedding present." Audrey slammed her glass down. "Do not bring up the past just because you are a miserable failure. Jamal makes 7 figures. We are building a legacy while you type useless computer stuff in the dark. Pay the bill or I will have security throw you out." I did not cry. I had shed my last tear for this family years ago when they forced me to drop out of medical school to care for my ailing aunt while they went on a European cruise. I reached into my purse and pulled out my worn debit card. It was tied to an account that held exactly $4,503. My entire life savings from doing freelance coding jobs. I placed the card in the leather folder and handed it to the waiter. "Happy anniversary, Jamal," I said. "Enjoy the dog gym?" I stood up from the table and walked out of the restaurant into the cold New York night, leaving them to their arrogant laughter. I took the subway back to my parents' suburban house and packed my few belongings into garbage bags. My bank account was now essentially empty. I had $3 left. I planned to go to the bank the next morning, close the account, and figure out how to survive on the streets. The next morning, rain was pouring down in sheets as I walked into the local branch of my bank. My clothes were damp, and I felt completely hollowed out. I approached the teller counter. The woman behind the glass looked me up and down, taking in my wet jacket and exhausted face with clear disdain. "I need to close my account," I said, sliding my identification under the glass. "I want to withdraw the remaining balance." The teller sighed dramatically and typed my name into her computer. "Let me see what we have here. Probably not even enough to cover the closure fee," she muttered under her breath. I stood there waiting for the final humiliation. But right at that moment, the branch manager, a balding man in a crisp suit, walked behind the teller line carrying a stack of papers. He casually glanced at the teller's screen as he passed by. He stopped dead in his tracks. The papers slipped from his hands and scattered all over the floor. He pushed the teller aside and stared at the monitor, his mouth hanging open. He looked up at me, then back at the screen, then back at me again. His face went completely pale. "Ma." He stuttered, his voice shaking loudly enough that several other customers turned to look. "Are you Naomi?" "Yes," I replied, confused. He immediately scrambled around the counter, leaving the teller completely bewildered. He practically bowed as he approached me. "Please write this way to my private office. We need to handle this with the utmost security. Can I get you a coffee? Some sparkling water?" I followed him into his plush office. He locked the door behind us and gestured for me to sit in a leather chair. He logged into his desktop and turned the monitor so I could see it. "Ma, have you checked your balance this morning?" he asked, his hands still trembling. "No," I said. "I spent my last $4,000 paying for my sister's dinner last night. I should only have $3 left." The manager swallowed hard. "Ma, your account currently holds $51 million. I stared at the screen. The numbers were right there. A 5 and a 1 followed by 6 zeros. My breath caught in my throat. The deal. It had actually gone through. For the past 3 years, while living in that damp basement and listening to my family call me a failure, I had been writing complex artificial intelligence algorithms. I designed a revolutionary AI software that could optimize architectural engineering and urban planning in seconds. I had been negotiating anonymously with a massive tech conglomerate for months. They had signed the purchase agreement last week, but the funds had been pending approval from the Trade Commission. The approval must have cleared overnight. "The money is verified," the manager said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The transfer came directly from a major tech conglomerate. We have automatically upgraded you to our highest-tier private wealth management division. I have already ordered your exclusive Centurion Black Card. It will be couriered here within the hour." I sat back in the chair, letting the reality wash over me. $51 million. I was no longer the basement-dwelling failure. I was a multi-millionaire. I had financial power that rivaled Jamal's entire investment fund. Just as I was processing this massive shift in my reality, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Jamal. I pulled out my phone and read the message. "I brought workers to smash the basement walls. We are starting the renovations early. All your trash is out on the lawn. Do not bother coming back." A slow smile spread across my face. I looked up at the branch manager. "I will wait for that black card," I said. "I have some trash of my own to take care of today." An hour later, holding the heavy metal black card in my pocket, I called an Uber Black to take me back to my parents' house. The rain had stopped, leaving a thick, humid air hanging over the suburban street. As the luxury SUV pulled up to the curb, I saw absolute chaos unfolding on the front lawn. Jamal was standing on the porch holding a cup of coffee and barking orders at three construction workers in dirty overalls. Audrey was right beside him, laughing and pointing her phone camera at the grass. Scattered across the muddy lawn were my clothes, my books, and my personal belongings. But what made my blood boil was seeing my original architectural sketches and the very blueprints that had inspired my $50 million software trampled into the mud. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were standing in the doorway watching the destruction with total indifference. I stepped out of the Uber and walked calmly up the driveway. Audrey noticed me first and immediately shoved her phone in my face, recording me. "Look, everyone," Audrey narrated loudly for her Instagram followers. "The homeless dropout has returned to claim her garbage. Smile for the camera, Naomi. Maybe someone will feel sorry for you and donate a tent." I ignored the phone and walked straight up to Jamal. "What gives you the right to touch my things?" I asked. Jamal smirked, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "I am the man of this extended family, Naomi. I make the real money. I provide the real value. Your parents gave me permission to clear out the basement, and I do not like waiting. Besides, doing you a favor by getting rid of this junk." I looked at my parents. "You just let him destroy my property." Patricia crossed her arms. "Oh, do not make a big deal out of nothing, Naomi. It is just some old papers and cheap clothes. You are moving out anyway. Jamal hired a professional crew to demolish the walls today. We cannot let your mess slow down progress." I looked at the workers who were hauling sledgehammers toward the side entrance of the basement. I did not scream. I did not cry. The panic and desperation they expected to see simply was not there. Instead, I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the rusted keys to the old Honda they forced me to drive and tossed them perfectly into the mud at Audrey's feet. "You can keep the junker," I said smoothly. "I will not be needing it anymore." Before Audrey could respond, I turned to the lead construction worker. "Excuse me," I called out. "How much is Jamal paying you to demolish that basement today?" The worker looked confused and glanced at Jamal before answering. $2,000 for the day, lady." I pulled the solid metal black card from my pocket. It caught the sunlight instantly, signaling extreme elite wealth. Jamal's eyes locked onto the card, and I saw his smug smile falter for a fraction of a second. As a wealth manager, he knew exactly what that card meant and how many millions you needed in the bank just to be invited to carry it. "I will pay you $10,000 right now if you stop walking toward that basement and instead load all my belongings into a protective crate," I said, holding out the card. The worker's eyes widened. 10 grand, just to move some clothes and papers." "Yes," I smiled. "And I will pay you an extra $2,000 to sweep the mud off the driveway before I leave." Jamal stepped forward, his face flushing red. "What kind of trick is this, Naomi? Where did you steal a fake credit card?" "You are flat broke. You paid for dinner last night with your last penny." I ignored him and tapped the card on the worker's portable payment terminal. The transaction was approved instantly with a cheerful beep. The workers immediately dropped their sledgehammers and began carefully picking up my things from the grass, treating my muddy sketches like sacred artifacts. Audrey lowered her phone, her mouth hanging open. "What is going on? How did you do that?" "Just moving out like you wanted, Audrey," I said, smoothing my jacket. "Oh, and by the way, I have already hired a luxury transport service. They should be arriving right about now." Right on cue. A massive, pristine white moving truck with gold lettering pulled onto the street, followed by a sleek, black Maybach. The movers stepped out wearing white gloves, ready to transport my freshly crated belongings. My parents stared in absolute shock. Richard finally stepped off the porch, his voice wavering. "Naomi, what is the meaning of this? Whose cars are these?" "They are mine, Richard," I said, dropping the title of Dad for the first time in my life. "I am going to my new home. I suggest you focus on your own home and the massive debt you are hiding from your golden child and her rich husband." I walked toward the Maybach, the driver holding the door open for me. Audrey ran down the steps, her voice shrill with confusion. "Where are you going? You do not have any money. You do not have anywhere to live." I paused at the door of the luxury car and looked back at my stunned family. The workers had finished sweeping the mud and were loading my crates into the pristine truck. "I am moving to Manhattan, Audrey." I smiled. "Specifically, I bought the penthouse at the Zenith Tower. I hear it has a beautiful view of the city." Jamal dropped his coffee cup onto the porch. It shattered hot liquid splashing onto his expensive Italian leather shoes. He knew that building well. Zenith Tower was the exact same building where his investment fund leased their corporate offices. I was not just moving to Manhattan. I was moving into the penthouse directly above his head. I slipped into the back of the Maybach, the soft leather enveloping me in comfort. As the driver pulled away from the curb, leaving my treacherous family standing in a puddle of spilled coffee and confusion, I took a deep breath. The war had just begun and I was holding all the winning cards. 3 weeks passed since I left my family standing in the mud. Tonight was the annual charity gala hosted by my parents' real estate firm. On paper, the event was designed to raise funds for affordable housing initiatives. In reality, it was a desperate cash grab. Richard and Patricia were bleeding money, and they needed fresh investors to keep their sinking ship afloat. They rented out the grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, trying to project an image of untouchable wealth they no longer possessed. I stepped out of my hired car wearing a custom emerald silk gown that cost more than my parents' current liquid assets. My hair was styled perfectly, and a brilliant diamond necklace rested against my collarbone. I walked through the gilded doors of the plaza and handed my physical invitation to the attendant. He scanned the barcode matching it to my name and immediately gestured toward the double doors, opening them wide for me. The ballroom was packed with Manhattan elite. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the room, and a string quartet played classical music softly in the background. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. I spotted my family almost immediately. They were holding court near the main bar, acting like royalty. Jamal was wearing a custom velvet tuxedo, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. Audrey stood right beside him in a tight red dress that looked incredibly uncomfortable and tried way too hard. She was laughing loudly at something an older prominent investor said, touching his arm with fake familiarity. My parents were busy working the room, shaking hands and selling their lies about upcoming commercial projects that would never actually be built. I walked straight toward the center of the room, making sure my heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. I did not hide in the shadows. I wanted them to see me. People naturally parted ways as I walked through. Conversations paused, and a few heads turned to admire the emerald gown. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and took a slow, deliberate sip. Audrey noticed me first. Her obnoxious laugh stopped abruptly. Her eyes widened, taking in the dress, the diamonds, and the absolute confidence radiating from me. She grabbed Jamal by the arm and pointed her perfectly manicured finger in my direction. Jamal almost dropped his bourbon glass. His eyes darted from my face to the diamond necklace and down to my designer shoes. He knew exactly how much my outfit cost, and he knew the sister he considered a worthless freeloader could never afford it. My mother. Patricia saw their reaction and turned around. The blood completely drained from her face the moment she saw me standing there holding my champagne glass. She marched across the room, her heels striking the floor with aggressive, angry force. Audrey and Jamal followed closely behind her, like loyal attack dogs. "What are you doing here?" Patricia hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid drawing attention from the wealthy donors standing nearby. "How did you even get past security?" "You are not on the guest list, Naomi." I smiled, taking another sip of champagne. "Actually, Mother, I am on the VIP list. I bought a platinum table right near the front. It cost me $50,000, a small price to pay to support such a wonderful fake charity event." Audrey let out a harsh, disbelieving scoff. $50,000. You probably stole a credit card from some rich guy in your new apartment building. Or did you rent that dress just to come here and beg for your basement room back? Listen to me, Naomi. Jamal's boss is here tonight. We need his investment firm to back Dad's new commercial project. You are going to ruin everything with your pathetic presence. Jamal stepped closer, puffing out his chest to tower over me. He looked me up and down with absolute disdain, his prejudice and arrogance shining through. I do not know what kind of scam you are running, Naomi, but you need to leave right now. You do not belong here. This room is for people who actually build things, people who create wealth. You are just a medical school dropout playing dress-up. Go back to whatever cheap motel you are staying in. I looked at Jamal, feeling zero intimidation. Really, Jamal? Because I heard your investment fund is currently under secret investigation by federal regulators for mishandling client assets. Are you sure you are the one who creates wealth in this room? Or do you just steal it from people who trust you? His face flushed a deep, angry red. Shut your mouth, he whispered fiercely, glancing around to see if anyone heard me. You have no idea what you are talking about. You are an unemployed loser who leeches off everyone around you. You are just jealous because Audrey married a winner. My father, Richard, finally noticed the commotion and hurried over. He looked stressed and exhausted. The heavy bags under his eyes were prominent despite his expensive tailored tuxedo. Naomi, he said, his voice tight with barely contained rage. I will not let you destroy this night. My company needs this funding. We are doing important work here, providing housing for the community. Do not ruin this with your usual negativity. You mean you are trying to secure funds to pay off your massive hidden debts? I countered smoothly, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. You have over-leveraged 3 different properties, Richard. You are lying to these investors just like you lied to me for my entire life. You are selling them a fantasy to fund your failing reality. Patricia grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully into my bare skin. Listen to me, you ungrateful brat, she growled, her voice trembling with fury. You are going to walk out those doors right now, or I will have event security throw you out physically. You are nothing but a massive disappointment to this family. You always have been and you always will be. Now get out before I make a scene. She shoved me slightly, trying to force me toward the exit doors. I held my ground, my expression completely calm and unbothered. I was just about to signal my personal security detail, who were waiting discreetly near the entrance, when a loud, deeply authoritative voice echoed behind us. Is there a problem here, Patricia? My mother froze. She let go of my arm instantly and turned around. Standing right behind her was Harrison Cole. He was a billionaire tech mogul, the founder of a global software empire, and arguably the most sought-after investor in the entire room. Everyone wanted a piece of his fortune. My father had been desperately trying to secure a simple 5-minute meeting with him for 6 long months, without any success. Mr. Cole? Patricia stammered, her demeanor instantly transforming from viciously aggressive to sickly sweet. No problem at all. We were just asking my troubled daughter to leave. She sneaked in here uninvited, and we do not want her disturbing important guests like yourself. Richard rushed forward, eagerly extending his hand. Mr. Cole, it is an absolute honor to finally meet you. I am Richard, the host of tonight's event. I have a revolutionary commercial real estate proposal that I know you will find incredibly lucrative. If we could just get 5 minutes of your valuable time. Harrison Cole completely ignored Richard's outstretched hand, leaving my father hanging awkwardly in midair. He looked at my parents with absolute sheer disgust. He then turned his intense attention to Jamal and Audrey, who were suddenly standing very straight, trying their best to look wealthy and important. I have zero interest in your proposals, Richard Harrison said, his voice cold and loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. And I certainly have no interest in doing business with desperate people who treat their own family like garbage. Patricia gasped softly, covering her mouth. Mr. Cole, you simply do not understand. Naomi is unwell. She does not belong in elite circles like this. She is just a failed student who refuses to get a real job. Harrison Cole let out a loud, booming laugh that made almost every single guest in our vicinity turn and stare. A failed student. That is hilarious, Patricia. Truly hilarious. He stepped forward, pushing past my mother and completely ignoring her shocked expression. He stopped right in front of me and buttoned his expensive suit jacket. Then in front of my entire stunned family, the wealthy donors and the silent room, he gave a slight, deeply respectful bow. Good evening, Boss Harrison said loudly and clearly, his voice carrying across the quieted ballroom. The integration of your artificial intelligence software is running flawlessly across all our global platforms. It is an absolute honor to see you tonight. The silence in the plaza ballroom was so profound, you could actually hear the ice melting inside the crystal champagne glasses nearby. Richard stood completely frozen, his hands still awkwardly suspended in the air, reaching for a handshake that would never be reciprocated. Patricia looked as though the polished marble floor had just dropped out from underneath her expensive heels. Jamal took a slow, instinctive step backward, his eyes darting wildly between the billionaire tech mogul Harrison Cole and me. But Audrey could not handle the shift in power. The sight of the most influential man in Manhattan bowing respectfully to the sister she had mocked and evicted just 3 weeks ago broke whatever fragile grip she had on her sanity. Her face contorted into a mask of pure ugly jealousy. She could not process a reality where I was the boss and she was the nobody. "Do not believe a single word she says," Mr. Cole. Audrey shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the vaulted ceilings. The remaining chatter in the room instantly died. Every single wealthy donor, corporate executive, and high society socialite turned to stare at the woman in the tight red dress who was rapidly losing her mind. "She is a total fraud," Audrey continued, marching forward and pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. "That software she sold you, that architectural artificial intelligence program, that was my idea. She stole my concepts from my elite real estate courses when we were in college. She is a thief and a pathetic college dropout who leeches off her betters to survive." The absolute audacity of her lie was staggering. The investors in the room began murmuring to each other, exchanging highly suspicious glances. Harrison Cole narrowed his eyes, observing the unfolding family drama with cold, calculating silence. Audrey stood tall, feeding on the crowd's sudden attention, believing she was actually winning them over. "She was expelled from her medical program because she is a compulsive liar," Audrey declared loudly, making sure every single person with a checkbook heard her. "She lived in our parents' dark basement for 5 years because nobody in this city would hire a known thief. Do not let her scam you out of your millions, Mr. Cole. That AI belongs to my real estate portfolio. She stole my thesis and rebranded it." I looked at my sister, feeling a profound sense of pity, mixed with utter disgust. She was so desperate to protect her spotlight that she was willing to commit career suicide in front of New York's absolute elite. I remembered the truth of those college years with perfect clarity. I remembered sitting awake for 3 straight nights, writing the complex algorithms and structural models for her final capstone project, because she had spent her entire senior semester partying on yachts. I remembered the day our parents found out I had done her work. Instead of punishing Audrey, Patricia and Richard had blamed me. They used the situation as an excuse to strip away my medical school tuition money, claiming I was untrustworthy and forcing me to drop out to care for our sick aunt while they continued to fund Audrey's luxury lifestyle. They had rewritten history to make Audrey the victim and me the villain. But tonight the truth was going to be broadcast loud and clear. I did not raise my voice. I did not scramble to defend my honor or desperately explain the truth to the whispering crowd. I simply turned my head slightly toward the back of the grand ballroom and made direct eye contact with a sharp-looking woman in a tailored black suit. It was Elena, my newly appointed executive head of security and operations. I had anticipated that my family would try to publicly discredit me the moment I stepped into their territory, so Elena had been standing discreetly near the venue soundboard for the past 20 minutes, waiting for my exact signal. I gave her a single subtle nod. Elena moved her hand with practiced efficiency. Instantly, the live-string quartet was cut off mid-note. The ambient background music died completely. A sharp electronic crackle echoed from the massive surround sound speakers mounted in all 4 corners of the ballroom. And then Audrey's voice filled the room. It was not the confident, arrogant tone she was using right now, but a desperate, pathetic whining sound from 7 years ago. "Naomi, please, you have to do this for me." The old audio recording boomed perfectly clear over the speakers bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. "If I fail this urban development and ethics class, they are going to expel me today. You know I cannot write a single line of code. You have to let me submit your architectural algorithm as my senior thesis. Mom and Dad will literally cut off my credit cards if I do not graduate with honors. Please, Naomi, just put my name on your work. I will owe you forever, I swear. The digital recording ended with the pathetic sound of Audrey sobbing loudly and blowing her nose. Elena hit a button, and the ballroom was plunged back into a deafening dead silence. I had kept that voicemail saved on a secure encrypted cloud server for 7 long years. I never actively intended to use it, but I also knew better than to ever delete proof of my own intellectual labor when dealing with people who had a history of stealing it. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and completely brutal. The wealthy investors Richard had spent months trying to court turned away in visible disgust. I could hear men in tuxedos muttering the words academic fraud and pathetic liability to their colleagues. Harrison Cole looked at Audrey as if she were a piece of garbage that had just stuck to the bottom of his shoe. He then looked directly at Jamal, who was physically shrinking away from his own wife, his face pale with ultimate humiliation. Jamal knew his own top-tier investment fund clients were standing in this very room, listening to his wife confess to intellectual theft. His reputation by association was bleeding out onto the marble floor. Audrey stood completely paralyzed in the center of the ballroom. The arrogant red dress suddenly looked like a massive glowing target. Her hands were shaking violently, and she looked frantically around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face to rescue her. She found absolutely none. The elite society she worshipped so desperately was now looking at her with absolute unfiltered contempt. My father realized in that exact moment that his entire carefully constructed life was over. His fake charity fundraiser was completely exposed as a sham. His professional reputation was annihilated in front of the only men who could have saved his bankrupt real estate company. His golden child, the daughter he had sacrificed my future for, was revealed to be a fraudulent, desperate liar who could not even pass her own college classes. Richard's face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. The veins in his neck bulged as he lunged forward, completely losing his mind. He closed the distance between us before my security detail could fully react. He raised his heavy hand and brought it down hard, slapping me across the face right in the middle of the grand hall. The sound of the impact echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. "Are you trying to destroy this family?" He roared, his voice cracking with desperation. I barely felt the sting on my cheek. I looked at the red handprint blooming on my skin in the reflection of a passing waiter's silver tray, but I did not raise a hand to touch it. I just looked back at my father, watching his chest heave with exertion. "There is nothing left to destroy, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You and Audrey did that all on your own." Harrison Cole stepped directly between us, signaling his personal security team with a sharp wave of his hand. "If you ever lay a hand on her again, Richard, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your pathetic life in a federal penitentiary," Harrison warned, his tone radiating absolute authority. I turned my back on my family and walked out of the Plaza Hotel, leaving them to drown in the absolute ruins of their reputation. Jamal, however, was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. His fragile ego had been shattered in front of his most important clients, and the fallout was immediate. The very next morning, he sat in his corporate office on the 50th floor of the Zenith Tower, sweating through his designer shirt. His desk phone rang incessantly. High-net-worth clients who had witnessed the disaster at the gala were pulling their investments. His career was evaporating by the second. He needed a scapegoat. He needed to strip away the one thing that gave me power over him: my money. As a high-level wealth manager, Jamal had extensive connections in the darker corners of the financial sector. He knew exactly how the global banking system worked, and more importantly, he knew exactly how to weaponize it against an innocent target. He realized he could not beat me in a boardroom, so he decided to destroy me using the federal government. Over the next few days, Jamal leveraged his corrupt network. He contacted a sleazy compliance officer at a rival banking institution, a man he had previously bribed to look the other way on questionable offshore accounts. Together, they manufactured a series of fraudulent, suspicious activity reports. Jamal compiled a thick, terrifyingly realistic file of fabricated evidence claiming that my $51 million deposit was not from a legitimate corporate software buyout. Instead, he painted a highly convincing picture of international money laundering, offshore cyber fraud, and illegal wire transfers funneling through shell companies. Jamal knew that the IRS acted fast when presented with credible threats of capital flight. He forged digital signatures and manipulated IP addresses to make it look like my algorithms were actually scraping financial data from overseas banks. He worked through the night fueled by pure hatred and cheap espresso, making sure every fake document looked completely bulletproof. He submitted this fake dossier directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. His goal was incredibly malicious. He wanted to trigger a federal asset freeze. He wanted to lock down every single penny I had earned, seize my property, trap me in endless legal battles, and watch me crawl back to the gutter where he firmly believed I belonged. I learned about their little victory lap from a former colleague of Jamal who still possessed a shred of conscience. The very afternoon Jamal received a back-channel tip that the IRS had taken the bait and opened an active case, my family hosted a lavish lunch at their exclusive suburban country club. They reserved a private table on the patio, ordered 3 bottles of vintage champagne, and toasted to my impending downfall. My mother, Patricia, apparently spent the entire afternoon bragging to her wealthy friends that justice was finally being served against her rebellious, ungrateful daughter. She played the perfect victim, claiming my sudden wealth was clearly illegal and that she had suspected my criminal activities all along. Audrey posted a cryptic but boastful photo on her social media, holding a crystal flute, with a caption about how karma always comes for liars and thieves. Richard ordered expensive cigars, puffing smoke into the crisp afternoon air as he mapped out how to spin my arrest to his creditors. He planned to tell the press that he had disowned me the moment he discovered my illegal activities, painting himself as a man of high moral standing. Audrey laughed so hard she spilled her drink, mocking the thought of me wearing an orange prison jumpsuit instead of my emerald silk gown. They were completely convinced that my bank accounts were about to be drained by the federal government. They envisioned me being dragged out of the Zenith Tower in handcuffs, crying and begging for their help. Jamal promised my father that once my assets were seized, the media would focus entirely on my alleged federal crimes, effectively distracting the public and their investors from the humiliating disaster at the charity gala. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had won the war. 3 days later, I was standing in the expansive living room of my penthouse, analyzing a new set of architectural algorithms on my high-definition display monitors. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. It was a perfectly quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that felt entirely secure. Then the private elevator chimed. My security director, Elena, walked briskly into the room, her expression completely rigid and her hand resting near her earpiece. "We have a situation," she said, keeping her voice completely level but urgent. "Federal agents are in the lobby. They bypassed the standard concierge desk, showed a federal warrant to the building manager, and are coming up the private elevator right now." Before I could even process her words, the heavy oak double doors of my penthouse swung open with aggressive force. 6 heavily armed agents wearing dark windbreakers with the letters IRS and FBI printed in bold yellow across their backs stepped into my home. They moved with tactical precision, immediately fanning out across the living room and blocking the exits. The lead agent, a tall, intimidating man with a stern face and a thick manila folder tucked under his arm, stepped forward and held up a gold badge. The agents did not wait for my permission. 2 of them immediately marched toward my primary workstation, pulling out heavy-duty cables and evidence bags. Another agent began photographing the serial numbers on my servers. The penthouse that I had bought with my own blood, sweat, and tears was suddenly a hostile crime scene. The lead agent stared me down, expecting me to panic or break down in tears just like Jamal had planned. "Naomi, we have a federal warrant to freeze all your financial assets and confiscate your servers immediately," he announced, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "You are currently under investigation for massive corporate fraud and international money laundering. Please step away from the computers." I did not step away from the glowing monitors. I simply tapped a single key, locking the encrypted screens with a customized biometric firewall that even the federal government would need a decade to crack. I turned to face the lead agent, my posture perfectly relaxed, despite the firearms holstered at their hips. "You must be Agent Miller," I said, reading the bold lettering on his golden badge. "I assume you are here regarding the suspicious activity report filed late last night, the one claiming my recent $51 million deposit was laundered offshore capital." Agent Miller narrowed his eyes, clearly thrown off by my absolute lack of panic. "Step away from the desk, Ms. Wilson. This is an active federal raid. Your assets are currently frozen pending a full forensic audit." Before he could reach for his handcuffs, the private elevator chimed again. The polished mahogany doors slid open, revealing a sharp-suited woman carrying a thick leather briefcase. It was Evelyn Vance, one of the most ruthless and expensive corporate defense attorneys in Manhattan. I had retained her services the moment my bank manager warned me about standard wealth monitoring protocols. Evelyn marched straight into the living room, completely unfazed by the armed agents. "Good morning, gentlemen," she announced, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. "I strongly suggest you put away the evidence bags before you open yourselves up to a massive federal lawsuit for unlawful search and seizure." Agent Miller scoffed, crossing his arms. "We have a judge-signed warrant, counselor." Evelyn opened her briefcase and slapped a certified dossier onto my glass coffee table. "And I have the fully executed Trade Commission-approved buyout contracts from Horizon Tech. The $51 million currently sitting in my client's account is the direct result of a legally binding software acquisition. Every single cent has been accounted for, taxed, and vetted by the federal government's own regulatory board. Your warrant is based on a fabricated tip." Miller grabbed the documents, his eyes scanning the official government seals and signatures. The aggressive posture of his team instantly deflated. It was impossible to argue with the paperwork. The money was cleaner than the marble floors we were standing on. Furthermore, Evelyn continued pulling out a second document. My client's cybersecurity team traced the origin of that anonymous tip. The IP address leads directly to a private terminal at Zenith Tower, specifically the corporate office of Jamal Blackwood. He filed a fraudulent federal report to weaponize your agency against a family member. Miller's face turned a deep shade of crimson as he realized he had been played. Filing a false report with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division was a severe federal offense. He aggressively shoved the documents back into a folder and signaled his team to stand down. Meanwhile, completely unaware that their pathetic trap had just imploded, my family was busy celebrating my supposed destruction. They had gathered in the private dining room of Jamal's exclusive country club, ordering bottles of vintage Dom Perignon that Jamal was paying for with stolen client money. Audrey was laughing loudly, practically vibrating with vicious joy. "I bet she is crying in the back of a police cruiser right now," Audrey gloated, holding out her glass for a refill. "Imagine losing $50 million in a single morning. She is probably begging for a public defender. I cannot wait to see her mugshot on the evening news." Jamal leaned back in his leather chair, puffing on a thick Cuban cigar. "I told you I would handle it," he bragged to my father, adjusting his expensive Rolex. "Nobody disrespects me in my own city. The IRS will tie her up in audits for the next decade. By the time they finish, the legal fees will leave her completely bankrupt. She will be back in the basement before Thanksgiving." My father, Richard, raised his glass, completely abandoning whatever shred of paternal instinct he had left. To Jamal, he toasted a true winner who knows how to protect the family legacy. "Now about that commercial real estate loan, Jamal. We need to secure those funds by Friday to keep the creditors off my back. If the bank forecloses on my properties, the entire company goes under." Jamal waved his hand dismissively. "Done. I will shift some capital from the offshore accounts this afternoon. Nobody will even notice it is missing. Just keep playing the successful developer, Richard. I have the finances under control." They clinked their crystal glasses, drowning in their own arrogance, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging down toward their necks. Back at my penthouse, the federal agents had retreated with quiet apologies, leaving me and Evelyn alone in the living room. Elena stood by the door, waiting for my next command. "Jamal wants to play games with federal agencies," I said, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. Let us see how his own firm holds up to a real audit. Evelyn unleashed the forensic accounting AI. I want every single transaction Jamal has made over the last 3 years analyzed and cross-referenced. Evelyn smiled a sharp, predatory grin. With pleasure. I booted up my secondary servers and activated the financial tracking algorithm I had designed. Within 45 minutes, the AI broke through Jamal's firm's basic security protocols and began pulling thousands of banking records, wire transfers, and offshore holdings. The massive flat-screen monitors lit up with red flags. It was an absolute bloodbath of financial crimes. Jamal was not a financial genius. He was just a common thief in a custom suit. The data revealed a massive, incredibly sloppy slush fund. He had been slowly embezzling millions of dollars from his high-net-worth clients, skimming percentages off their returns and funneling the cash into untraceable Cayman Island accounts. This was the exact money he was using to fund Audrey's designer wardrobe, the country club memberships, the luxury cars, and the illegal loans he was feeding my father's failing real estate company. "We have him," Evelyn said, looking at the scrolling data with utter amazement. "This is textbook wire fraud and embezzlement. The SEC will tear him apart. He is looking at 20 years in federal prison." I crossed my arms, processing the sheer volume of his deceit. "Sending him to jail is too easy," I murmured. "He tried to take my company, my money, and my freedom. I want his entire world. I want the ground he stands on. Who owns the majority stake in his boutique investment fund?" Evelyn tapped her tablet, bringing up the corporate hierarchy. "A massive private equity holding company based in Chicago. They own 80% of the voting shares. Jamal is just a glorified employee playing managing director. Word on the street is the Chicago firm has been looking to divest their East Coast assets for months to cover their own liquidity issues." "Buy it," I commanded, my voice entirely devoid of hesitation. "Use the Horizon Tech funds. Buy the parent company. Buy the building lease. Buy every single chair and desk in his office. Offer them double the market value for an immediate, unannounced cash buyout. I want total controlling interest by tomorrow morning." The next day, Jamal was sitting behind his massive oak desk on the 50th floor of the Zenith Tower. He was bouncing his knee, riding the high of his supposed victory, actively transferring another $200,000 of stolen client money into Audrey's personal checking account to pay for a spontaneous shopping trip to Milan. He felt invincible. The heavy glass doors of his corner office suddenly swung open. His executive assistant rushed in, looking completely terrified, clutching a stack of freshly printed legal documents. "Mr. Blackwood," she stammered, dropping the papers onto his desk, her hands shaking violently. "You need to see this immediately. It is a hostile takeover notice. The Chicago Holding Company just sold their entire 80% stake in this firm." Jamal scoffed, waving his hand in annoyance. "That is impossible. I am the managing director. They cannot sell the firm without notifying the board. Who the hell has the capital to buy out an entire investment fund in less than 24 hours? I do." The voice cut through the room like a frozen blade. Jamal's head snapped up, his face drained of all color, matching the crisp white dress shirt he was wearing. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. I stepped into his office, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal power suit carrying a single manila folder. Evelyn and Elena flanked me like heavily armed guards. I walked slowly across the plush carpet, rounding his desk, and looked down at the man who had ordered me to pay his restaurant bill just a few short weeks ago. "Hello, Jamal?" I smiled, resting my hands on the back of his expensive leather chair. "I believe you are sitting at my desk." The color completely vanished from Jamal's face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a custom-tailored suit. He stared at me, then at Evelyn, and finally down at the thick stack of acquisition documents resting on the polished mahogany. His eyes darted across the corporate seals and the irrevocable signatures of the Chicago Holding Company executives. The reality of his absolute ruin was staring him right in the face. "This is illegal," Jamal sputtered, his voice cracking, as he scrambled out of the leather chair. "You cannot just buy a financial institution overnight. There are regulatory waiting periods. There are board approvals. I will call the SEC. I will have this entire transaction voided." Evelyn simply tapped the top of the folder with her manicured fingernail. Private equity buyouts can be expedited under extreme distress clauses, Mr. Blackwood, especially when the parent company is presented with irrefutable evidence that their managing director is running a massive offshore embezzlement ring. They practically begged us to take this toxic asset off their hands to avoid a federal indictment. Jamal froze. His bravado instantly evaporated. The mention of his offshore accounts hit him like a physical blow. He looked at the floor, breathing heavily as his mind desperately tried to calculate a way out of the trap he had built for himself. He had spent years judging my worth based on my bank account, and now his own bank accounts were about to send him to federal prison. "Naomi, wait!" Jamal said, his tone suddenly shifting from aggressive to sickeningly sweet. "Let us not be rash here. We are family. We have had our disagreements, but at the end of the day, we share a bond. You are a brilliant software developer, but you do not know the first thing about managing a top-tier investment fund. You need me to run this place. I know the clients, I know the market. We can be partners." I walked around the desk and took a seat in the plush leather chair he had just vacated. I swiveled slightly, steepling my fingers, and looked up at him. "Partners," I repeated, letting the word hang in the quiet office. "You mean like how you partnered with Audrey to throw my belongings onto the muddy lawn? Or how you partnered with a corrupt compliance officer to file a fake IRS report against me this morning, hoping to see me locked in a federal holding cell?" Jamal swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "That was a misunderstanding. I was just trying to protect the family from what looked like suspicious financial activity. I was looking out for you." "Do not insult my intelligence, Jamal," I said coldly. "I have the digital footprint tracing the IRS tip directly to your IP address. But that is not even your biggest problem today. Your biggest problem is the missing $12 million you skimmed from your elite clients to fund your ridiculous lifestyle." Jamal's knees literally buckled. He grabbed the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The arrogant wealth manager who had tossed a $4,000 dinner bill onto my empty plate was completely broken. "Please, Naomi." He begged, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "You cannot expose those accounts. If the feds see those ledgers, I am finished. Audrey and I just closed on a $6 million mortgage for a summer house in the Hamptons. We have the loans on the luxury cars. We are over-leveraged. If I lose this job, the banks will take everything. I will be ruined." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk. "It is incredibly ironic, Jamal. You sat at Le Cuckoo and called me a freeloader. You told me I provided zero value to society because I did not wear a Rolex or drive a Mercedes. But everything you have is built on stolen money. You are the ultimate freeloader, living off the hard-earned wealth of people who actually trusted you." He dropped to his knees right there on the expensive corporate carpet. The sight of him groveling was pathetic. He clasped his hands together, looking up at me with sheer terror in his eyes. "I will do whatever you want," Jamal pleaded, tears actually spilling down his cheeks. "I will pay back every cent. I will work for you for free. Just please do not fire me. Do not call the authorities. I have a family to support. Audrey will leave me if I lose the money. Please, Naomi, show some mercy." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no hesitation. "This desk is for competent people, Jamal," I stated, my voice echoing with finality. "It is not for criminals, and it is certainly not for freeloaders. You are officially terminated, effective immediately." Before Jamal could process his termination, the heavy glass doors of the office swung open again. This time, it was not a terrified executive assistant. It was 4 uniformed officers from the Financial Crimes Unit, accompanied by 2 federal agents. Elena stepped back, allowing the authorities to enter the room. I handed the agents a secure encrypted flash drive containing every single piece of data my AI had scraped from Jamal's hidden servers. The offshore ledgers, the fake client returns, the illegal wire transfers, and the forged IRS report. It was a complete, undeniable package of federal crimes. Jamal Blackwood, the lead officer, announced, stepping forward with a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and filing false federal reports. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Jamal did not fight. He could not even stand on his own. Two officers had to haul him to his feet, physically pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. He sobbed openly, his designer suit wrinkling as they dragged him toward the door. "Wait!" Jamal cried out, looking back at me as the officers pulled him into the hallway. "Naomi, please, you have to call Audrey. You have to tell her to hire a lawyer. Please." I did not answer him. I just turned my chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the city. The officers escorted Jamal out of the corner office and marched him directly through the center of the trading floor. Every single employee, analyst, and junior broker in the firm stood up from their desks to watch their arrogant managing director being paraded through the building in handcuffs. The whispers started instantly spreading through the Zenith Tower like wildfire. By the time they forced him into the crowded main lobby of the building, hundreds of corporate professionals were watching his humiliating exit. He was shoved into the back of a police cruiser in the middle of a busy Manhattan street, his reputation completely shredded and his freedom permanently revoked. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was an incoming call from Audrey. News of Jamal's very public arrest had clearly reached the suburbs. I let it ring. The empire they had tried to build on my back was currently burning to the ground, and I was going to enjoy watching the smoke rise. I watched the screen of my phone flash with Audrey's name until it finally went dark. It rang again immediately, and then again. I simply reached over and switched the device to silent mode, tossing it onto the polished mahogany desk that now legally belonged to me. For the first time in my 32 years of life, I was entirely in control of who had access to my energy and my time. I spent the rest of the afternoon working alongside Evelyn and my new executive team to completely restructure the investment firm, stripping away every single corrupt policy Jamal had implemented. By 5 o'clock, the federal asset freezes had officially hit Jamal's personal accounts. I knew exactly what was happening out in the pristine, wealthy suburbs. Audrey was likely standing at a checkout counter at some luxury boutique, or trying to pay a massive tab at an expensive restaurant, clutching a completely useless piece of plastic. When the federal government freezes assets in a massive embezzlement and wire fraud case, they do not leave a single dime for groceries, let alone designer handbags and spontaneous trips to Europe. Her reality, the fake legacy she had constantly lorded over me, was unraveling at light speed. Around 8 o'clock that evening, I was sitting in the expansive living room of my Zenith Tower penthouse, sipping a glass of sparkling water and enjoying the quiet hum of the city far below. The absolute serenity of my home was suddenly shattered by violent, frantic pounding on my front door. It was not a polite knock or a simple ring of the doorbell. It was the sound of someone trying to break through solid oak with their bare fists. "Open this door, Naomi. Open it right now, or I swear to God I will break it down." Audrey's voice was completely hoarse, raw, with a level of hysteria I had never heard from her before. Elena, my security director, immediately stepped out from the hallway, her posture completely rigid, and her hand resting near her communication earpiece. She bypassed the main lobby desk. Elena stated, her eyes locked on the front door. She must have slipped into the private access elevator right behind one of the building residents. Should I call the police and have her removed? "No," I said, standing up and setting my crystal glass down on the marble coffee table. "I will handle this one personally. Open the door, Elena." Elena unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door wide open. Audrey practically fell into my foyer. She looked absolutely deranged. The perfectly styled hair she had flaunted at the Plaza Hotel charity gala just days ago was a tangled, frantic mess. Her expensive makeup was smeared down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks from crying. She was wearing a luxury trench coat hastily thrown over wrinkled gym clothes, and her eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. "You psychotic, vindictive monster!" Audrey screamed, stepping aggressively toward me with her hands curled into tight fists. "You have to fix this right now. Do you hear me? You have to call whoever you bribed at the FBI and fix this." I stood perfectly still, my hands casually resting in the pockets of my tailored trousers. Fix what, Audrey? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. The fact that your husband is a federal criminal who stole millions of dollars from his own clients. I am afraid I do not have the power to fix a federal indictment that he brought upon himself. Audrey let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. She paced the foyer, her expensive sneakers squeaking against the polished stone floor. My credit cards are declining, she gasped, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. I tried to pay the retainer for a white-collar defense attorney, and the bank told me every single account was seized. Jamal is sitting in a federal holding cell, and the judge denied him bail because he is a flight risk. You have to drop the charges, Naomi. You have to go to the police and tell them you made it all up. Tell them you transferred that money into his accounts by mistake. I tilted my head, studying the pathetic, desperate woman standing in front of me. You want me to commit perjury to save the man who actively tried to frame me for international money laundering this very morning. You want me to bail out the man who destroyed my property on our parents' front lawn and laughed about me becoming homeless. We are family, Audrey shrieked, stomping her foot like a petulant toddler throwing a tantrum. You owe us. We let you live in our house for 5 years. We kept a roof over your head when you dropped out of school. You have over $50 million. You can afford to pay his bail and hire the best defense lawyers in the city. Give me a blank check right now so I can get my husband out of a cage. The delusion was so deeply ingrained in her psyche that she genuinely believed I was obligated to rescue her from the consequences of their own horrific actions. She still saw me as the basement-dwelling failure whose sole purpose in life was to facilitate and fund her luxury lifestyle. I do not owe you a single penny, Audrey, I stated, my voice dropping to a calm, lethal register. You and Jamal built a fake life on stolen money. You built your entire identity on belittling me while secretly living off the funds your husband embezzled from innocent people who trusted him. The government is going to take your massive house. They are going to take your luxury cars. They are going to take every piece of designer jewelry you own to pay back the victims. You are going to have to get a real job for the first time in your life. The words hit her like physical blows. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, feral rage. The reality of losing her elevated status of becoming a normal working-class citizen completely broke her fragile mind. I will kill you, Audrey roared. She lunged at me across the wide foyer, her hands outstretched, aiming directly for my throat. She was completely unhinged, driven by pure desperation and blinding jealousy. But I had spent the last 5 years dodging the emotional and psychological attacks of this family, and I was certainly not about to let her land a physical one. I did not flinch. I simply took a swift, calculated step to the left. I did not even raise my hands to block her attack. I just shifted my weight and let her own reckless, furious momentum carry her forward into empty space. Audrey missed me completely. She stumbled violently, her sneakers slipping on the slick, polished marble of the entryway. She let out a sharp shriek as she lost her balance, completely failing to catch herself. She crashed hard into the tall, decorative pedestal standing near the double doors. Resting on that pedestal was a priceless, authentic Ming Dynasty porcelain vase I had acquired at an auction just last week. The heavy impact of Audrey's body sent the marble pedestal toppling over. The ancient vase hit the floor, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces with a deafening, explosive crash. Audrey hit the ground right after it, landing directly in the center of the sharp porcelain debris. She wailed, clutching her bruised knee as she thrashed around in the ruined remains of the artifact. Right on cue, the private elevator doors behind her slid open with a soft chime. 4 massive building security guards stepped out into my foyer, followed closely by 2 uniformed officers from the New York Police Department. Elena had signaled them the exact moment Audrey had bypassed the lobby security desk. The officers took one look at the shattered ancient vase, the screaming woman thrashing on the floor, and my perfectly calm security director standing nearby. Officers, I said, smoothing the lapels of my suit jacket. This woman forced her way into my private residence, threatened my life, and destroyed my property. That vase was valued at $400,000. I am officially pressing charges for trespassing, attempted assault, and felony property damage. Audrey stopped screaming and looked up at the police officers in absolute terror. "No!" she gasped, scrambling backward on the floor, her hands getting scraped on the broken porcelain. "No, you do not understand. I am her sister. I am family. You cannot do this to me, Naomi. Tell them I am your sister." The officers did not hesitate or wait for an explanation. They moved forward immediately, grabbing Audrey by the arms and hauling her roughly to her feet. They spun her around, forcing her hands behind her back, and slapped cold steel handcuffs onto her wrists right there in my pristine foyer. I watched with complete silence as they dragged my screaming, thrashing sister toward the elevator, her desperate pleas echoing down the hall until the heavy doors slid shut. The penthouse was finally quiet again. Elena immediately directed the night staff to sweep up the remnants of the shattered Ming Dynasty vase. I watched the cleaning crew work with absolute precision, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. The destruction of a $400,000 artifact was a minor inconvenience compared to the utter silence that now filled my penthouse. For the first time in my life, the toxic noise of my family had been forcibly removed from my environment. But parasites do not simply accept defeat when their host cuts them off. They mutate and find a new way to feed. 4 days passed since Audrey was hauled out of my foyer in handcuffs. In that short amount of time, the reality of their situation had come crashing down on my parents. With Jamal sitting in a federal detention center, completely unable to post his $5 million bail, the stolen funds feeding my father's failing real estate business instantly dried up. The banks officially filed notices of default on Richard's commercial properties. Audrey was out on bail, but her assets were frozen solid, leaving her completely dependent on our parents, who were now staring directly into the abyss of absolute financial ruin. They had lost their golden child, they had lost their stolen wealth, but they still had their massive egos and an infinite capacity for manipulation. I was sitting in my corporate office at Horizon Tech, reviewing the structural overhaul of Jamal's former investment firm, when Evelyn burst through the heavy glass doors. She did not bother knocking. Her face was an unreadable mask of pure professional intensity. "Turn on the television," Evelyn commanded, grabbing the remote from my conference table and pointing it at the massive flat screen mounted on the wall. "Channel 7 right now." I set my tablet down as the screen flickered to life, displaying the brightly lit studio of a wildly popular national daytime talk show. The banner flashing across the bottom of the screen read, "Billionaire Betrayal, the Family Left Behind." Sitting on the plush studio couch, looking like two broken, tragic figures, were my parents. Patricia was wearing a faded, oversized cardigan that I had never seen before, intentionally styled to look like she bought it from a thrift store. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and she wore zero makeup, allowing the harsh studio lights to highlight every wrinkle and dark circle on her face. Richard sat beside her, hunched over with his hands clasped tightly together, looking like a frail, elderly man who had been beaten down by the world. The talk show host, a woman famous for her dramatic, sympathetic interviews, was leaning forward, clutching Patricia's hand. Patricia, the host, said, her voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. "Tell our audience what happened. How did your own daughter, the woman you raised and loved, turn into this corporate monster?" Patricia squeezed her eyes shut, forcing two perfect tragic tears to roll down her cheeks. She dabbed at them with a cheap tissue. "We gave Naomi everything," she sobbed, her voice trembling flawlessly. "We supported her dreams. We sacrificed our own retirement savings to fund her early tech projects. We loved her unconditionally. But the moment she made her first $1 billion, the money completely poisoned her soul. She looked at us like we were garbage, like we were peasants who did not deserve to breathe the same air as her." I leaned back in my executive chair, crossing my arms. The sheer audacity of her lies was almost impressive. She had never given me a single dime. She had called my software engineering a pathetic hobby while throwing thousands of dollars at Audrey's designer shoe collection. Richard let out a heavy, mournful sigh and looked directly into the camera. "My son-in-law Jamal is a good, honest man. He managed a boutique investment firm with absolute integrity. Naomi wanted to force him into a hostile takeover to strip the assets and leave his employees jobless. When Jamal bravely refused to engage in her corrupt corporate raiding, she orchestrated a massive federal witch hunt. She bribed auditors and fabricated evidence to steal his firm and destroy our family. The studio audience actually gasped in horror. And your other daughter, Audrey, the host, prompted, shaking her head in disbelief. What happened when she tried to intervene? Patricia let out a loud, dramatic wail, burying her face in her hands. My poor sweet Audrey, Patricia cried. She just wanted her husband back. She went to Naomi's luxury penthouse to beg for mercy. She got down on her knees and pleaded with her sister to drop these fake charges, and Naomi had her brutally assaulted. She had her massive security guards throw Audrey to the floor, and then she had her own sister arrested. She threw her own flesh and blood into a concrete cell just to prove how powerful she is. The host turned to the camera, her expression hardening into absolute disgust. You are watching the devastating reality of extreme wealth greed and the destruction of the American family. We will be right back after this commercial break. Evelyn muted the television and turned to face me. This broadcast has been airing for exactly 12 minutes, and it is already a catastrophic public relations nightmare. Evelyn tapped her tablet, bringing up a barrage of data feeds. They have orchestrated a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Social media is completely exploding. The hashtags Boycott Horizon and Justice for Audrey are currently trending globally across all major platforms. People love a victim, and your parents are playing the role perfectly. They are painting you as a sociopathic tech billionaire who ruthlessly oppresses her elderly parents and tortures her innocent siblings for sport. I watched the muted television screen, observing my parents sharing a comforting hug as the broadcast cut to a commercial. We are already seeing the fallout. Evelyn continued pacing across the thick carpet of my office. Activists are organizing a protest outside the Zenith Tower. Our corporate social media accounts are being flooded with death threats and vile insults. Several of our mid-tier software clients have already called, demanding emergency meetings because they are terrified of the public backlash. Your parents are actively trying to destroy your company's reputation to force you into a settlement. We need to issue a press release immediately. We need to release the security footage of Audrey destroying your penthouse to prove they are lying. No, I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through Evelyn's frantic energy. We are not releasing anything. We will not play their game in the court of public opinion. Evelyn stopped pacing and stared at me. Naomi, the public is calling you a monster. They believe you are starving your elderly parents and framing an innocent man. If we do not counter this narrative, they will ruin your public image permanently. Let them talk, I replied, picking up my tablet and returning to my emails. My algorithms dictate the market, Evelyn. My software runs the back end of half the financial institutions in this city. I do not care if a bunch of strangers on the internet think I am a terrible daughter. Public opinion does not impact my bottom line. My parents are throwing a theatrical tantrum because they are completely out of options. They have no money, no leverage, and no power. This talk show is the last desperate gasp of a dying animal. Before Evelyn could argue further, the private elevator doors at the end of the executive suite opened. Elena marched down the glass hallway, her boots making no sound against the carpet. She stepped into my office holding a thick, formal manila envelope bearing the heavy red seal of the New York State Family Court. A process server just attempted to bypass the lobby security desk, Elena reported, handing the envelope directly to me. I intercepted him. He was specifically instructed to serve this to you in front of the press gathered outside the building, but we caught him at the loading dock. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Open it, she instructed. I broke the red seal and slid the heavy stack of legal documents onto my desk. I read the first page, and a cold, sharp smile slowly spread across my face. My parents were not just crying on daytime television for public sympathy. The broadcast was a calculated setup for their real attack. They are suing me, I announced, tossing the first document toward Evelyn so she could read it. They filed a formal petition for a mandatory family mediation hearing. Evelyn quickly scanned the legal jargon, her jaw tightening. They are invoking an archaic filial responsibility law. They are officially claiming that they exhausted their entire life savings and sacrificed their own financial stability to fund your early career. They are stating that they are now entirely destitute and unable to provide for their own basic medical and housing needs. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the absurd demands printed on the final page of the petition. They are legally demanding a $10 million lump sum payment for past emotional distress. I read aloud, my voice laced with dark amusement. And they are requesting a court-ordered elderly maintenance stipend of $200,000 a month for the rest of their natural lives. They want me to legally fund their luxury lifestyle under the guise of elder care. Evelyn dropped the document onto the desk. The judge actually approved the preliminary hearing based on their televised sob story. You are legally required to attend a mandatory mediation session with them and their lawyers on Friday morning. If you refuse to show up, the judge could freeze a portion of your personal assets pending a full trial. I looked out the massive windows of my office, staring down at the tiny figures of protesters gathering on the sidewalks far below, holding up signs demanding justice for my corrupt family. My parents genuinely believed that by weaponizing the public and dragging me into a courtroom, they could bully me into submission. They thought the threat of a public scandal would force me to open my checkbook and buy their silence. "Prepare the legal team, Evelyn," I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. If my parents want to sit in a courtroom and legally swear under oath about where their money really went, I am more than happy to oblige them. Let us go to mediation. Evelyn nodded, her predatory smile returning with absolute ferocity. We immediately shifted our focus from defensive strategies to total annihilation. If my parents wanted to open up their financial history in a court of law to demand maintenance money, they were going to have to expose every single ledger they had ever touched. They had just handed us the legal right to rip their entire financial existence apart. I authorized Evelyn to unleash the exact same forensic accounting AI we had used to destroy Jamal. This time the algorithm was directed at Richard and Patricia. I wanted every corporate filing, personal banking record, tax return, and offshore transfer from the last 3 decades scrutinized. We needed to prove they never spent a single dime on my tech career to easily dismiss their absurd lawsuit. The AI chewed through millions of encrypted data points, scanning for anomalies. It took exactly 48 hours for the system to hit a massive concrete wall of fraud. I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking black coffee when Evelyn walked in holding a single printed spreadsheet. She looked completely disturbed, which was entirely out of character for a woman who routinely destroyed corrupt billionaires for a living. She placed the paper face down on the cold marble counter. "We found out why your father's real estate company magically survived bankruptcy 20 years ago," Evelyn said, her voice deadpan. "We also found out how your parents afforded Audrey's exclusive private schools, the European vacations, the designer wardrobes, and the expensive country club memberships, while simultaneously telling you they were completely broke." I flipped the paper over. It was a bank manifest from an incredibly exclusive wealth management firm based in Geneva. The account holder was listed as a locked trust, specifically the Naomi Wilson Educational and Enterprise Trust. The initial deposit was a staggering $5 million. The benefactor was my late maternal grandfather. My heart completely stopped in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. My grandfather had passed away when I was 12 years old. He was a quiet, brilliant man who built a modest fortune through patent investments. He was the only person in the family who ever praised my intelligence or encouraged my interest in coding. He bought me my first computer. I always thought he died penniless because my mother constantly complained about having to pay for his funeral arrangements. "He left this entirely to you," Evelyn explained, tapping a specific line on the ledger. "It was an ironclad trust designed to mature the exact day you turned 18. It was meant to fund your university tuition and any business ventures you chose to pursue. He explicitly and legally excluded Audrey and both of your parents from accessing a single cent. He knew exactly what they were." I traced my finger over the final column of numbers. The balance was currently 0. "How did they get it?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Evelyn pulled out a secondary stack of documents from her briefcase. These were heavily redacted, notarized withdrawal slips and transfer authorizations. They forged your signature, she stated flatly. The day after you turned 18, your parents submitted a mountain of falsified documents to the Geneva Bank. They claimed you were transferring full power of attorney over the trust directly to them due to a severe medical incapacity. Over the next 6 months, they systematically drained all $5 million. They funneled the cash through 3 different shell companies before dumping it directly into Richard's failing real estate firm and Patricia's personal checking accounts. I stared at the forged signatures on the paper. It was a sloppy, desperate attempt at copying my handwriting. The magnitude of their betrayal washed over me, bringing a suffocating wave of realization. They had stolen my future to fund my sister's present. Every single time my mother called me a financial burden, she was projecting her own guilt. Every time she told me I owed them for keeping a roof over my head, she was actively living off my inheritance. They had branded me a freeloader while literally eating, sleeping, and traveling on my stolen money. They did not just steal my money, I said, standing up from the counter as a lethal calm washed over my entire body. They stole my 20s. I worked 3 jobs to pay for night school. I lived in a roach-infested studio apartment, eating instant noodles while building my software company from scratch. They watched me starve while sleeping on Egyptian cotton sheets bought with my grandfather's money. Evelyn crossed her arms, her eyes hardening. Grand larceny, wire fraud, and identity theft. The statute of limitations on trust fraud resets upon the date of discovery. We just discovered it today, Naomi. Do not just prepare a defense for this ridiculous mediation, I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute authority. Call the federal authorities. Call the exact same FBI agents who dragged Jamal out of his office. I want federal warrants drafted. I want their bank accounts seized. I want this locked, loaded, and ready to detonate by Friday morning. Evelyn's eyes gleamed with anticipation. Consider it done. Friday morning arrived with torrential freezing rain matching the dark, heavy mood hovering over the city. The mediation was held in a private, high-security conference room at the downtown courthouse, purposely chosen to avoid the massive media circus my parents had manufactured outside. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a sharp, pristine white power suit that practically glowed in the dreary gray light of the building. Evelyn flanked my right side while Elena covered my left, acting as a physical shield against the chaotic energy of the courthouse. We walked into the conference room to find my parents already seated at the long, heavy oak table. They looked absolutely nothing like the weeping, frail victims they had portrayed on national television. Patricia was wearing a brand new Chanel blazer, her hair perfectly styled, and her posture straight. Richard was wearing a custom-tailored suit, checking his heavy gold watch with an air of absolute arrogance. Their attorney, a slick, highly paid litigator who specialized in high-profile celebrity settlements, sat beside them with a smug, confident grin. He clearly thought this was going to be a quick, easy shakedown. He genuinely believed the public pressure and the trending hashtags had broken my resolve. Patricia smiled a vicious, triumphant little smirk as I took my seat directly across from her. I am so glad you decided to be reasonable, Naomi, she said, her voice dripping with fake maternal affection. We do not want to destroy your company or your reputation. We just want what is fair. We just want what we are owed for raising you. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms across his chest. $10 million up front and $200,000 a month. Those terms are completely non-negotiable. Sign the papers today, and we will go back on television and tell everyone you are making amends. Refuse, and we will spend the next 5 years tying your entire corporate structure up in litigation while the press tears you apart piece by piece. Their lawyer slid a thick, glossy settlement agreement across the polished table. It is the best deal you are going to get, Ms. Wilson. I highly suggest you sign it and save yourself the public humiliation. I did not even look at the document. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table and looked directly into my mother's eyes, letting her see the absolute void of empathy I held for her. I am not signing anything, I stated clearly, my voice echoing in the quiet room. Patricia scoffed, rolling her eyes in exaggerated disbelief. Then the public backlash will bankrupt you. You are being a stubborn, foolish little girl just like you always were. You have no leverage here. I reached down beside my chair and lifted a heavy reinforced titanium briefcase. I placed it squarely in the center of the oak table, causing the wood to groan slightly under the weight. I clicked the dual locks open, the sharp metallic snap cutting through the silence of the room. I flipped the lid back. Inside was not a counter-settlement offer. It was a massive stack of federal indictments, forensic banking ledgers, and sealed court orders. Every single document was stamped with the bold, bright red seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "I am not here to negotiate a settlement," I said, sliding the massive stack of red-stamped federal documents across the table directly into my father's lap. "I am here to collect my $5 million. The heavy titanium briefcase sat on Richard's lap like an unexploded bomb. The sharp metallic thud it made against his knees seemed to echo endlessly in the sterile acoustic environment of the courthouse conference room. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. The air in the room grew thick and suffocating. Richard stared down at the bright red FBI seals glaring up at him from the pristine white paper. A single bead of sweat formed at his temple and slowly rolled down the side of his face. His arrogant posture evaporated instantly, replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to take hold. Patricia swallowed hard, her perfectly glossed lips parting in silent shock. She looked from the briefcase to my face and back again, her eyes darting frantically as her brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the trap they had just walked into. Marcus Thorne, the celebrity litigator, stopped tapping his expensive pen. He leaned forward, his professional curiosity suddenly replaced by genuine alarm. As a lawyer who survived by protecting the wealthy from public ruin, he knew exactly what a federal indictment seal looked like. He knew they were not handed out lightly, and he certainly knew they were not used as bluffing tactics in family court mediations. "This is absurd!" Richard finally sputtered, his voice lacking all of its previous authority. He shoved the heavy briefcase off his lap, pushing it roughly onto the center of the oak table. "You think you can walk into a legal mediation and intimidate us with fabricated federal documents? I am a respected businessman in this city, Naomi. You cannot just invent a crime to get out of paying your obligations." "I did not invent the crime, Richard," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "You committed it, you documented it, and you left a paper trail a mile long across international borders." Richard slammed his hand against the table, trying to summon his usual aggressive dominance. "It was family-managed money, Naomi. You were an 18-year-old girl who knew absolutely nothing about finance or wealth management. You were completely incapable of handling a $5 million portfolio. As your parents, as the heads of the household, we had the legal and moral right to reallocate those assets to protect our family. The real estate market was taking a downturn. We needed liquidity to survive. It was not stolen. It was invested in our collective survival." Patricia nodded vigorously, her self-righteous entitlement returning in a desperate flash. "He is exactly right," Patricia snapped, pointing an accusing finger at me. "We put a roof over your head. We clothed you. We fed you while you sat in your room playing with computers. We were facing bankruptcy. What kind of selfish, ungrateful child hoards millions of dollars while her own family struggles to survive? We took that money because we deserved it. It was compensation for raising a completely difficult and ungrateful daughter." I tilted my head, studying the two deeply delusional people sitting across from me. "You did not reallocate those assets to survive a market downturn," I replied, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet pitch. "You took my inheritance and bought a $1.2 million luxury yacht for Jamal and Audrey. You bought matching Mercedes-Benz SUVs. You paid for Audrey to spend 6 months backpacking across Europe, staying in 5-star resorts while I was working double shifts at a diner to pay for my community college textbooks. You did not manage my money, Patricia. You liquidated my future to fund your absolute vanity." Thorne held up his hands, attempting to interject and regain control of the room. He pulled the briefcase closer to him and quickly flipped through the top pages of the banking ledgers. "Let us remain professional here," Thorne said, trying to project an air of legal superiority. "Even if there are discrepancies in how the trust was handled, the fact remains that a power of attorney was legally granted. Furthermore, the events you are describing took place over a decade ago. The statute of limitations on civil financial disputes regarding family trusts has long since expired in this state. You cannot walk in here and threaten my clients with expired claims just to avoid settling this current maintenance petition. Fraud completely nullifies the standard statute of limitations. Mr. Thorne Evelyn interjected, her voice sharp and perfectly calibrated. Especially when the active concealment of that fraud is ongoing and the discovery of the crime occurred exactly 48 hours ago, and it was not a power of attorney, it was a forgery. Thorne scoffed, shaking his head. You cannot prove forgery on a document processed by a Swiss bank almost 20 years ago. That is a baseless, inflammatory accusation. I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made Patricia flinch in her seat. Elena, I said without breaking eye contact with my mother. Open the doors. Elena stepped immediately to the heavy oak double doors at the back of the conference room and pulled them open. Standing in the hallway, leaning heavily on a silver-tipped walking cane, was an elderly man in a meticulously tailored three-piece suit. His gray hair was perfectly combed back, and his sharp, intelligent eyes swept the room with absolute authority. He carried a weathered leather satchel in his free hand. He stepped into the conference room, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Patricia let out a sharp, audible gasp, pressing her hand against her mouth. Richard's face drained of color entirely, turning a sickly ash gray. He shrank back into his leather chair, looking like a terrified child. Allow me to introduce our special witness, I announced, gesturing to the elderly man. This is Arthur Sterling. Thorne looked between his terrified clients and the new arrival. Who is Arthur Sterling? I was Theodore's personal estate attorney and the original named executor of the Naomi Wilson Educational and Enterprise Trust. Arthur stated, his voice deep and resonant. He walked slowly toward the table, taking a seat directly next to me. He placed his leather satchel on the table and unbuckled the straps. Arthur looked across the table, glaring at my parents with a level of utter contempt that words could barely capture. Your father knew exactly what you two were, Patricia, Arthur said, his tone laced with disgust. He knew Richard was a reckless, arrogant fool who would eventually run his real estate firm into the ground. And he knew you would enable his greed at the expense of your own daughter. That is exactly why he hired my firm to construct an ironclad trust. He wanted to ensure that Naomi had a future that you could not touch. You were explicitly, legally, and permanently barred from accessing those funds under any circumstances. Arthur pulled a thick, pristine file from his satchel and laid it on the table. For years I wondered how you managed to bypass my firm. Arthur continued tapping the file. I assumed Naomi had simply come of age and chosen to authorize the transfer herself. It was not until Ms. Wilson's investigative team contacted me 2 days ago and showed me the Geneva withdrawal records that I realized the depth of your depravity. You bypassed my firm by going directly to the international branch with falsified medical documents claiming Naomi had suffered a catastrophic brain injury and was entirely medically incapacitated. Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the closed doors as if calculating a way to run. It was a misunderstanding, Richard stammered, his voice shaking. We had temporary guardianship. It was federal fraud. Arthur snapped, silencing him instantly. When Ms. Wilson showed me these documents, I immediately engaged a certified independent forensic handwriting analyst. We compared the signature on the Geneva withdrawal slips to Naomi's actual signature taken from her high school academic records and her federal student loan applications. Arthur opened the file and slid a multi-page forensic report across the table directly toward Marcus Thorne. The results are absolute and legally conclusive, Arthur stated. The signature on the power of attorney transfer is a highly amateur, clumsy forgery. The pressure applied to the paper, the loop of the letters, the angle of the slant, everything points to a forced replication. It was a sloppy, desperate forgery executed by someone who did not even bother to trace it properly. Thorne picked up the forensic report, his eyes scanning the detailed technical breakdown and the undeniable visual comparisons. His smug confidence was completely gone, replaced by a cold, creeping panic. Furthermore, Arthur continued delivering the final devastating blow. The medical doctor who supposedly signed your emergency incapacitation order was a man named Dr. Leonard Vance. My investigative team pulled his records yesterday. Dr. Vance lost his medical license and was federally barred from practicing medicine 2 years prior to the date printed on your document. He was indicted for accepting bribes to write fake prescriptions. You used a disgraced criminal to sign a fabricated medical emergency form to steal a $5 million trust fund from your own daughter. Thorne dropped the forensic report onto the table as if it were on fire. He stared at the document, then slowly turned his head to look at Richard and Patricia. The realization hit the celebrity lawyer like a freight train. His clients had not just lied to him about their financial history, they had actively concealed a massive multi-million-dollar federal conspiracy and then willingly dragged him into a state courthouse to file a fraudulent civil petition based on those exact lies. They had inadvertently made him an accessory to ongoing extortion. Thorne stood up so fast his heavy leather chair slammed into the wall behind him. He aggressively shoved his legal pads and pens into his briefcase, snapping it shut with a loud, violent click. "Mr. Thorne," Patricia stammered, reaching out a trembling hand toward him. "Where are you going? We need to explain this. We can fight this." Thorne looked at her with pure professional rage. "I am formally withdrawing, as your legal counsel effective immediately." Thorne stated, his voice shaking with fury. "I will not represent clients who actively conceal federal felonies and use my firm to commit extortion. Do not ever contact my office again." Thorne turned and marched out of the conference room, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him, leaving my parents completely alone, entirely exposed and utterly defenseless. Judge Harrison watched the lawyer flee before turning his piercing gaze back to my parents. The mediator looked absolutely repulsed. Evelyn stepped forward, resting her hands on the table. "In case you are struggling to comprehend the reality of your situation, let me break it down for you," Evelyn said, her voice slicing through the silence. "Grand larceny, wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, embezzlement of a protected trust. The Federal Bureau of Investigation received all of this evidence directly from Mr. Sterling yesterday evening. They have already moved to freeze your remaining offshore accounts. They will seize your commercial real estate, your personal vehicles, your jewelry, and your home to pay back the stolen $5 million, plus 2 decades of compounded interest." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, locking eyes with my mother. "The maximum sentence for wire fraud involving international banking institutions is 20 years in a federal penitentiary," I said, my voice perfectly calm, softly echoing in the quiet room. "You brought me to court today demanding that I fund your luxury lifestyle. You demanded $200,000 a month. Instead, you are going to lose every single thing you have ever owned, and you are going to spend the rest of your natural lives sleeping on a concrete cot wearing a prison uniform." The illusion of superiority that Patricia had worn for 30 years shattered completely. The luxurious Chanel blazer suddenly looked like a costume on a terrified, fragile old woman. The absolute reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her face turned stark white, and a terrible raspy sound escaped her throat. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her perfectly manicured fingers clawing at the wood as her breathing became rapid and shallow. She clutched her chest, her eyes rolling back slightly as a massive, suffocating panic attack completely overtook her body. Patricia gasped for air, her chest heaving violently as the walls of her fabricated empire finally collapsed, crushing her beneath the weight of her own greed. The sharp, ragged sound of Patricia struggling to breathe echoed off the mahogany walls. She clutched her chest, sinking to the floor in a wrinkled heap of Chanel silk and panic. Richard did not even reach down to help his wife of 40 years. He sat completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the massive stack of federal evidence resting on the table. The illusion of their absolute power had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the pathetic reality of 2 cornered criminals. Before Judge Harrison could signal the court bailiff to call for medical assistance, the heavy oak doors of the conference room burst open once again. Audrey stormed into the room, her face contorted in a mask of sheer panic and feral rage. Right behind her, looking like a haunted shell of his former arrogant self, was Jamal. He had been released on bail just hours prior, and he still wore the rumpled, wrinkled suit he had been arrested in. His eyes were wide, darting around the room like a trapped rat. They had clearly run into Marcus Thorne in the hallway and heard the devastating news. "What did you do?" Audrey shrieked, ignoring her mother hyperventilating on the carpet. She marched directly toward Richard, slamming her hands onto the polished table. Thorne just ran out of the building screaming about federal indictments and forged trust funds. "What did you do to my money?" I stood up slowly, buttoning my blazer. "My money, Audrey?" I asked, my voice perfectly level, slicing through her hysterical outburst. "I believe you mean my $5 million inheritance. The money your parents stole to fund your designer wardrobe, your destination wedding, and that ridiculous yacht." Audrey whipped her head toward me, her eyes widening as the pieces finally clicked together. She looked down at the forensic handwriting analysis and the Geneva bank statements scattered across the table. The reality of the situation hit her with absolute brutal force. The stolen wealth she had built her entire fake identity upon was gone, and the federal government was coming to collect. Jamal pushed past Audrey, grabbing the bank ledgers with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the shell company transfers and the offshore accounts. He dropped the papers as if they burned his skin. "You told me this was clean capital," Jamal yelled, turning on Richard with absolute venom. "You told me the initial investment for my firm came from a legitimate family trust. You forced me to sign as a guarantor on the shell companies. You tied my name to a federally protected stolen asset. You set me up to take the fall for your embezzlement." Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed state, his face flushing dark red. "Do not you dare put this on me," Richard roared, slamming his fist on the table. "You gladly took that money, Jamal. You never asked questions when you were buying luxury cars and taking my daughter to the Amalfi Coast. You are a complete failure who drove your own firm into the ground, and now you want to play the victim. You are a weak, pathetic excuse for a businessman." Patricia suddenly scrambled up from the floor, her panic attack magically disappearing in the face of an argument. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at Jamal. "You are a parasite," she shrieked. "We gave you everything. We bought you that yacht to make you look like a successful man because you were nothing but a fraud. You ruined our daughter's life." Audrey let out an ear-piercing scream, grabbing her mother's arm and yanking her back. "Do not blame him," Audrey roared, her face red and distorted. "You did this. You told me it was family money. You told me Naomi was a selfish failure who owed us for letting her live in the basement. You told me I deserved the yacht. You told me I deserved the wedding. You forged the signatures and you made me spend it. You orchestrated this entire lie because you wanted to look rich in front of your country club friends." Jamal turned back to Richard, his voice shaking with pure malice. "I am not going to federal prison for you, Richard. I am calling my defense attorney right now. I will tell the FBI exactly how you structured the shell companies. I will hand them every single email and wire transfer you ever sent me. I will gladly testify against you to secure a plea deal." I watched the scene unfold with absolute cold satisfaction. The picture-perfect Wilson family, the wealthy suburban elite who had spent 30 years looking down their noses at everyone else, were now tearing each other apart like rabid animals. There was no loyalty. There was no love. The moment the stolen money disappeared, they instantly cannibalized each other to save their own skin. Evelyn leaned close to me, a sharp, amused smile playing on her lips. "It is truly remarkable how quickly the rats will eat each other when the ship starts sinking," she whispered. Arthur Sterling sat beside us, observing the chaotic screaming match with a look of profound disgust. He shook his head slowly. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of you, Naomi," Arthur said softly. "You did exactly what he hoped you would do. You survived them and you protected the legacy he actually wanted to leave behind." I nodded, keeping my eyes locked on the pathetic display of mutual destruction happening across the table. "I did more than survive them, Arthur. I made sure they could never do this to anyone else." The screaming escalated. Jamal was threatening to wear a wire. Audrey was sobbing hysterically, screaming that her bank accounts were frozen and her friends were laughing at her. Patricia was slapping her hands against the table, wailing about her ruined social life and her seized assets. Richard was shouting over all of them, completely red in the face, veins bulging in his neck, trying to physically intimidate Jamal, but failing miserably. Enough. The single word cracked through the room like a gunshot. Judge Harrison brought his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block with incredible force. The sharp explosive sound instantly silenced the screaming family. Judge Harrison stood up, his black robes flowing around him. He looked at my parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law, with a level of revulsion reserved for the lowest forms of criminals. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely witnessed a display of such profound moral bankruptcy. Judge Harrison stated, his voice cold and unwavering. You walked into this courthouse demanding that this young woman empty her pockets to fund your lifestyle, all while actively covering up the fact that you robbed her blind the moment she became an adult. You are not a family. You are a criminal syndicate. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, to launch into another desperate sob story, but the judge raised his hand, silencing her immediately. Do not speak, Mrs. Wilson, the judge commanded. You have done quite enough talking. This mediation is officially terminated. I am dismissing your petition for filial support with extreme prejudice. You will not receive a single cent from Ms. Wilson. You have absolutely no legal or moral standing in this court or any other. Richard slumped back into his chair, his eyes darting wildly toward the exits. But what about the house? Richard stammered, his voice small and pathetic. What about our property? We have nowhere to go. My business is bankrupt. We cannot survive without the maintenance stipend. That is no longer a matter for this court. Judge Harrison replied, packing the thick stack of federal indictments and forensic banking ledgers into his leather briefcase. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented here today, I am immediately transferring this entire case file directly to the Federal Economic Crimes Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The judge looked directly at Richard and Patricia, his expression completely unyielding. I suggest you stop arguing with each other and start looking for a very good criminal defense attorney, Judge Harrison said. Because the federal government does not negotiate, and they certainly do not care about your social standing. Court is adjourned. The judge turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving my family standing in the absolute wreckage of their own making. I picked up my tablet and my designer handbag. I looked at Audrey, whose makeup was completely ruined by her terrified tears. I looked at Jamal, who was staring at the floor in complete defeat, knowing his attempt to throw his in-laws under the bus would not save him from his own complicity. And finally, I looked at my parents. They had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin, no more guilt trips to leverage, no more fake tears to cry. They were entirely broken, stripped of their wealth, their power, and their freedom. Elena opened the heavy oak doors for me. Evelyn stepped through first, followed by Arthur. I walked out of the courthouse, stepping into the cold, crisp city air, leaving the toxic remnants of the Wilson family behind me forever. 6 months passed since that day in the courthouse, and the absolute destruction of my family's fabricated empire was nothing short of spectacular. The federal authorities did not hesitate to act on the mountain of evidence Arthur Sterling and I had handed over. The IRS, the SEC, and the FBI dismantled Richard's real estate firm with surgical precision, exposing decades of fraudulent accounting and illegal offshore transfers. Every single asset they had hidden, every luxury car, every piece of designer jewelry, and every commercial property was seized to pay back the victims of Jamal's embezzlement and the massive tax penalties they had accumulated. My parents were forcefully evicted from their sprawling suburban mansion. With their bank accounts frozen and their credit completely destroyed, they were left with absolutely nothing. They were forced to move into a cramped, decaying one-bedroom apartment in a notorious run-down neighborhood in Queens. The irony was almost poetic. Patricia, who once threw away perfectly good designer shoes simply because they were out of season, now had to count coupons and carefully budget her meager government assistance just to afford basic groceries. The woman who used to host lavish country club galas now spent her days sitting in a dingy living room, listening to the sirens wailing outside her single-barred window. Richard was entirely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his towering ego. The stress of the federal investigation and the total loss of his social status had aged him 20 years. He spent his days staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper of their tiny apartment, jumping every time someone knocked on the door. Not a single one of their wealthy country club friends came to their rescue. The moment the federal indictments hit the evening news, their entire high society circle vanished into thin air, treating my parents like a contagious disease. Jamal did not fare much better. His frantic attempt to turn state's evidence against Richard only partially saved him. The federal judge showed absolutely zero leniency for his role as the architect of the investment firm's embezzlement scheme. He was officially sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary in upstate New York, completely cut off from the luxury and power he once wielded. But it was Audrey's downfall that provided the most profound sense of absolute karmic justice. Following Jamal's conviction, Audrey's assets were completely liquidated by the government. Her prized suburban mansion, the massive estate she had constantly bragged about and used to belittle my own living arrangements, went into immediate foreclosure. The most beautiful aspect of that foreclosure was the institution executing it. 2 months prior, my corporate entity, Horizon Tech, had aggressively acquired a controlling interest in Vanguard Financial, the exact bank holding the deed to Audrey's house. Evelyn had walked into my office one afternoon and placed the official foreclosure documents directly on my desk. I did not even blink. I authorized the immediate eviction with a single stroke of my pen, ensuring my sister was escorted off the property by local sheriffs without a single piece of furniture. Audrey was left entirely destitute. She had no college degree, no marketable skills, and zero work ethic. She could no longer rely on Jamal's stolen wealth or our parents' fraudulent funds. For the first time in her pampered, entitled life, she had to get a real job. The only place willing to hire a 32-year-old woman with a massive gap in her resume and a highly publicized federal scandal attached to her last name was a giant discount supermarket on the outskirts of the city. It was a Tuesday evening, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the supermarket buzzed loudly overhead. Audrey was wearing a hideous, stiff polyester uniform shirt that was 2 sizes too big. Her perfectly manicured hands were now raw and calloused from breaking down cardboard boxes and scrubbing checkout counters. Her expensive highlights had completely faded, leaving her hair looking dull and neglected. She was assigned to the closing shift. Her manager, a strict, no-nonsense woman who did not care about Audrey's previous zip code, barked orders at her constantly. Audrey was tasked with mopping the sticky linoleum floors near the entrance and emptying the overflowing trash bins near the magazine racks. Audrey dragged a heavy, leaking black trash bag across the floor, her back aching and her feet throbbing in cheap, generic sneakers. She paused near the checkout aisle, leaning against a metal display rack to catch her breath. She wiped a streak of sweat from her forehead, feeling a deep, suffocating wave of misery wash over her. She hated the smell of the store. She hated the customers who ignored her. Most importantly, she hated the reality that this was the rest of her life. As she stood there trying to gather the energy to drag the garbage bag out to the dumpsters, her eyes drifted toward the brightly lit magazine stand. Right in the center of the premium display rack, illuminated by a spotlight, was the latest issue of Forbes magazine. Audrey froze. The heavy trash bag slipped from her raw hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Staring back at her from the glossy cover of the magazine was a high-definition portrait of me. I was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, my arms crossed, and an expression of absolute calm confidence on my face. The bold, gold lettering of the headlines stretched across the page. The Silicon Valley Sovereign: How Naomi Wilson Built a $30 billion empire on her own terms. Audrey's breath hitched in her throat. She stepped closer to the magazine rack, her hands trembling as she read the bullet points beneath the headline. The article detailed my successful acquisition of 3 major financial institutions, the global expansion of Horizon Tech, and my newly established philanthropic foundation dedicated to funding young female software engineers. The contrast was absolute and entirely crushing. Audrey looked down at her stained polyester uniform. She looked at her cracked fingernails and the dirty mop bucket sitting beside her. She remembered the $1.2 million yacht. She remembered the designer clothes, the exclusive parties, and the way she used to laugh at me for working late in my apartment. She remembered standing in my penthouse foyer screaming that I was a failure who owed her everything. Now she was quite literally taking out the trash while my face graced the cover of the most prestigious business magazine in the world. The humiliation crashed into her like a physical weight, completely shattering the last remaining fragments of her delusion. She realized in that agonizing moment that she had never been superior. She had only been a parasite feeding off a host she secretly envied. "Hey!" A sharp voice cut through her thoughts. Audrey jumped, spinning around to see her manager standing at the end of the aisle, pointing an angry finger at her. "I did not pay you to stand around reading magazines," the manager snapped. "Get that garbage out to the loading dock right now, or I am docking your pay for the hour." "Yes, ma'am," Audrey whispered, her voice cracking. She bent down, grabbing the sticky plastic strings of the garbage bag, hauling it over her shoulder, as she shuffled away from the magazine rack, keeping her eyes glued to the dirty floor. Miles away from that dismal supermarket, I was standing on the expansive rooftop terrace of my new corporate headquarters. The city skyline stretched out before me, glittering with millions of lights. The air was cool and crisp. Evelyn stepped onto the terrace, holding 2 crystal glasses of sparkling water. She handed one to me, joining me at the glass railing. "The acquisition of Vanguard Financial is fully integrated," Evelyn noted, taking a sip. "And the legal team confirmed that the federal prosecutors have officially frozen the last of your parents' offshore accounts. They have absolutely zero resources left to contest the restitution orders." I took a slow sip of my water, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. "They thought they could break me," I said, looking out over the glowing city. "They genuinely believed that if they screamed loud enough and manipulated enough people, I would eventually fold. They underestimated exactly who they were dealing with." Evelyn smiled, a sharp, predatory expression. "They dug their own graves, Naomi. You just handed them the shovels." I looked up at the clear night sky, thinking of my grandfather. He had seen the truth long before I ever did. He knew the toxic, corrupt nature of my parents, and he had tried to protect me the only way he knew how. They had stolen his money, but they could not steal the intellect, the drive, and the unyielding resilience he had recognized in me. The Wilson family legacy of lies and theft had been completely eradicated. I had not just survived their abuse, I had systematically dismantled their entire world and built an untouchable empire on the ashes. I turned away from the railing, walking back toward the brightly lit boardroom where my executive team was waiting to discuss our next global expansion. I was finally entirely free.